I'm going to read a little bit from the last story in my collection. It's called The Fortunes of Others. And like many of the stories in this collection, this this particular story is about parenting and what it means to love and to face loss as a parent. This particular story, The Fortunes of Others, was inspired by a Rabindranath Tagore story called Kabuliwala. And I wanted to take a different frame of the very famous Tagore story and tell it from a different point of view, in the case of this story, from the point of view of an Afghani merchant. So I think that's all you need to know, and I'll go ahead and read for a little bit. The Kabuliwala, angling for a spot near the front of the train, noticed little around him. He was passing through one of the busiest stations in the world, but these days the journey felt as familiar as the cup of ginger chai he would permit himself in the evenings. A little boy was tugging on his pants, but little boys had tugged on his pants hundreds of times over the years, each with their own mantra of need. It was only when this boy said ice cream, or maybe it was only cream, that the Kabuliwala stopped, because it was said with such fierce candor. Ice cream, the boy said, shoving against his kneecaps. The Kabuliwala realized that he was being ordered by this sturdy creature who he doubted had a penny in his pocket. Cream, the boy said again, pointing his finger at the freezer with cones and cups and several flavors of ice cream. The Kabuliwala rarely attended to beggars. For one, he himself subsisted on the slimmest of margins, and moreover, the children who begged on behalf of their families disturbed him in ways he didn't care to admit. Still, he considered the price. A cup cost 2 rupees and a cone 3. He bought the little boy a cup of chocolate and vanilla. The boy's name was Sundar, which meant beautiful. He was too dirty to be considered beautiful, though if a guardian were to thoroughly scrub and wash, one could imagine, if not beauty, then at least a note of sweetness in that face with a mane of curly hair. He watched the boy savor his ice cream. Perhaps he was used to favors from tourists, but not from someone as poor as he. I'll have another, Sundar said, as if he owned the train tracks and the trains that ran on them. It was enough to make the Kabuliwala laugh. He would have bought the boy another if he could have spared the change. Where's your family? The Kabuliwala asked. The boy pointed at a solitary goat chewing on the grass between the tracks. Sister, he said. Then he pointed at a stray puppy who was bounding toward them. Brother. Where do you come from? The Kabuliwala asked. The boy's eyes were as green as his own. Sundar shrugged and gave his cup a final lick before relinquishing the container to his puppy. I go where he goes, the boy said, scratching the little mutt between his ears. That night, the train was delayed by 14 hours, for a low fog had settled over the north, and everything south of Varanasi was running with a limp. The Kabuliwala unrolled his bedding and shared space with the little boy, who curled up beside him with such ease that for a moment the Kabuliwala believed they were related. He wanted to ask how old the boy was, but knew the answer wouldn't matter. 5, he guessed, maybe 6. Sundar's hair smelled of gunpowder, and when the boy began to snore, the little pup settled his body over the boy's legs like a blanket. As a young man, the Kabuliwala had traveled the Hindu Kush with his burlap bags of cardamom and perfume, work that had served him well enough to eventually finance a wife and afterward a child, a boy who hardly cried, or so he remembered, the decades having turned his firstborn increasingly cherubic. When the Taliban came, the Kabuliwala took up arms, Kabul fell, music became a memory, every woman wore a burda, and there was little work to be found. One winter evening, his family perished, struck by mortar shell. He crossed the border a final time with his bag of cardamom and perfume, a skeleton of a man by the time he reached Kolkata, though each morning he applied attar and smelled as fresh as the housewives who'd sample his wares. When the train finally arrived, the boy put his hand in the kabuliwala's. "We travel together," he said, indicating the pup who was mewling at his feet. "I cannot support you," the kabuliwala said. "Myself, I barely eat most nights." "His name is Arun," the boy said, taking the pup into his arms. "He has a good nose. We will find what we need." The kabuliwala bribed the ticket checker when he came, paying a slightly higher fee for Arun, who howled like a wolf whenever the train sped through the fog. Though it had been his habit to travel the spice circuit with a boy and dog in tow, the kabuliwala decided to stay in Varanasi when they arrived, at least for a while. He called in a favor with an old merchant friend, and in exchange for half the profits was set up in a shop painting the busts of Hindu deities. It was simple, mindless work that paid just enough for a sparse meal for the three of them. If they wanted more, Sundar would lead his dog to the riverbanks, where he often found something half-eaten and delectably so, a box of almond pastries, just a day stale, sweet lentil balls that someone had wrapped in newspaper and dropped by the water, only a little wet. In this way, approaching his 50th birthday, the kabuliwala felt that he had come close to restoration, that something worthwhile from his youth had once again been revealed. They found lodging in the attic of a garment warehouse, where sometimes the owner would let the boy in downstairs to peruse the 1,000 colors of garments. He learned that his name meant beautiful, and since Sundar didn't know his birthday, they agreed the day of their first meeting would serve as that. Sundar turned 7 and began to work for the kabuliwala and to attend school one day a week. The shop stood next to a monastery that was popular with foreigners, and the kabuliwala had sold more of his painted Parvatis and lacquered Ganeshas to the clientele of the monastery than anyone else. Now that he had a child and pet to support, he was wary of wasting time with the wrong customers. When the fair-skinned walked into his shop, he would abandon whatever conversation he was having with the locals who came, most often just to peruse. He'd devote his attention to the English or the Americans or the Germans and praise the spiritual quality of his pieces. He didn't believe in God, certainly not in a many-armed one, but he believed that the fervor he held in his heart for his family would prompt his customers to open their wallets. Sometimes he used Sundar to help move the merchandise. Sundar's English language skills had quickly surpassed the kabuliwala's, so the kabuliwala would assume a mystic's pose while Sundar worked his charms. His boy would say, "This one is most spiritual," or "This one have good energy." And with the exchange of a wink and a smile, he'd have the foreigners in his palms. They'd been having a slow month when Hannah first came. Arun the mutt was napping in the midsummer heat, and the boy had skipped school to help add detail to his statues of Lakshmi, the goddess of wealth. Hannah strolled around the shop, lifting trinkets, then setting them down. She seemed to have little interest in what they offered, but smiled whenever Sundar smiled at her. The kabuliwala guessed that she was a familiar of the monastery from the wilted look she'd donned when she'd first passed by their store. He knew that look, having seen many foreigners in the haze of the unmoored. Explain, the kabuliwala whispered. Sundar did as told. He walked her from aisle to aisle, holding her hand while narrating the spiritual benefits of the statues and prayer paintings. Though he went to school less and less, spending most of his time in the shop and walking the mutt in the evenings, who knew where, the boy's English had continued to improve. Not even 8, and he could slang talk a smile out of anyone who passed through. Perhaps his father, the original one, had been a charmer, a teller of tales, though it was impossible to know, the boy having largely forgotten that first life. There was only the life of the shop with its ever-growing collection of statues and their family, or so the Kabuliwala believed. Sometimes they shared an ice cream and relived their first meeting. The boy had never asked for anything more. Hannah lingered until the boy grew impatient, then left the shop, having bought one of the smaller statues they had, the bust of a frog with no religious meaning whatsoever, though he guessed that Sundar had fluffed even this, added the frog into some modern pantheon. She returned to the store several times a week. As the monsoons approached, some days she was their only customer. The Kabliwala would see her tall frame crouching through the entrance and immediately stand to greet her. He'd silently praise the seeming infinitude of her pocketbook, for by buying what Sundar had showed off, she paid for their evening meals. Each afternoon, she stayed longer at the store until her visits became ritual, the Kabliwala arranging a chair with a cushion where she'd sit to chat with Sundar while sipping tea from their sole porcelain cup. The gatekeeper at the monastery was a fellow refugee from Afghanistan who shaved and pretended to be a Hindu, and the Kabliwala began to ask about the American. He was grateful for her purchases, but began to grow curious and even a little wary of her intentions. In an early awkward exchange, she'd offered her name. There was little else beyond that. For Sundar grew coy when asked about the substance of their conversations, which happened now not only at the store, but sometimes out elsewhere in the neighborhood, when hand in hand his boy would cart Hannah around like a prize. She was long of limb and muscular in the arms. Maybe she'd played some sort of sport. Sometimes she would come to the shop with a prayer marking on her forehead, a white shawl wrapped around her shoulders despite the heat. Other times she would come in her faded jeans and a shirt that showed her arms to full effect. The gatekeeper relayed what he'd learned. Their best customer was a divorcee and rich to boot. Weren't they all the ones that bought? She hailed from a part of America where snow covered the streets more than half the year, which made the Kabliwala think of his time passing through the Himalayas, of the lonely yaks he chained himself to in order to navigate the storms, the fires he'd lit in the bellies of trees to thaw. Once, Hannah had thought of becoming a monk, the gatekeeper said, but now she mostly came to the monastery for chai and chat. How long is she to stay? The Kabliwala asked. For they had seen her every day, the better part of a month. No one knows, said his fellow refugee. She pays for her room week to week. That night when the Kabliwala came home by the side door of the garment shop, Sundar wasn't there. Arun the mutt, who'd grown plump on scraps, was restless, so he led the dog to the riverbank, where after scavenging for his meal, his old friend lifted a leg and released a long stream into the river. The Kabliwala circled from the riverbank to his shop in search of Sundar. His boy knew the streets, but almost never stayed out past dusk. He'd made a few friends at school, but always had dinner with the Kabliwala before taking Arun for a stroll. The Kabliwala searched for an hour, lightheaded with exhaustion and worry. When he returned to the garment shop, he found Sundar asleep on his cot. Something curled close to his body. Aiming his flashlight, he saw the evidence of an intruder. His little boy was holding a stuffed tiger in his arms. The dog sniffed and licked the soft fur of the thing as the little boy turned away to snore. In the first year of their acquaintance, the Kabliwala made it clear that he needed his own bed. The little boy kicked and in the beginning released pockets of gas from turn to turn, but that wasn't the reason. The Kabliwala had grown used to the solitude of his sleep and wished for Sundar to appreciate the same. But on this night, the Kabliwala placed his body, nowadays his neck nearly always stiff, his knees hardly suitable for long walks, his chest hair all turned gray, next to his little boy, and when the rains came to cool the air, still felt warm from bone to bone. The Kabliwala didn't approve of Hannah's gift. His own son had died before his 5th birthday without ever having such a toy. Sundar would walk with the tiger as if they were conjoined twins, at all hours the fur grazing his hip. Tiger Friend, he named it, striking long, elaborate conversations in multiple languages. After a week of this, the Kabliwala made his displeasure known. "This is not manly," he said. "You are losing your heart." Sundar scoffed, though by the way the boy avoided his gaze, he could tell his words had an effect. What he'd wanted to say was that attachment to such things was dangerous. Again and again, he had seen the world take and not give back. It was better to swim without stones. He took Tiger Friend and placed it on a high shelf. That evening, as they were closing up, Hannah came by. "Why did you tell him the wrong thing?" she asked. She seemed upset, but he'd only understood half her words. Her English sometimes delivered too quickly to parse. He looked to Sundar for translation. "She doesn't like that you took Tiger Friend," the boy said. "She thinks it's bad fathering." He was too shocked to speak. What would a customer have to say about the way he raised his son? "Go now," he said. He was a tall man and dwarfed nearly everyone in town, but this woman stood eye to eye with him. In his country, such a statement would have been unforgivable. They were no longer in Afghanistan, though this fact did little to soften his gaze. He worried about all the days of abbreviated meals ahead. "No need you," he finally told her. "No need money." "I'm sorry," she said, perhaps realizing her mistake. She made a motion of apology that he'd seen as a child. She touched her hands to her forehead, then to her heart, leaving with a muted goodbye. Sundar walked to the back of the store and made a show of dusting off the statues, and the Kabliwala tried to ignore his boy as long as he could. He fed Arun the mutt, tallied the day's paltry earnings. The air between them grew so thick that the dog whelped his anxiety. "Quiet," the Kabliwala cried. "Baba, how will we eat?" Sundar asked. It was the first time the boy had called him Baba. He thought of his firstborn, those pale little hands, serpentine eyes. What a wound it was to have known that love. Now there was another who cared for him as much or more, and he in turn had given the whole of his affection without regret. To protect this boy, this life, he would have walked into the bullets of the Taliban. "We have always managed," the Kabliwala said. "We will not go hungry." And I think I'll pause there.
Am I heard? Can you hear me?
I can hear you. Yeah.
Okay, great. Thank you. That was so beautiful to hear read in your voice. Um,
Thank
I,
you.
I I love that story, and I particularly love the ending of that story, which is really both sad and hopeful.
Mm,
And it involves, for those of you who haven't yet read it, it involves father and son observing a ritual on the Ganges. And I often think about or think of ritual as what we do when there's nothing else to do,
mm,
right?
mm.
Um, and so I wondered if you could talk about the way that ritual functions in that ending, what it offers the characters, and maybe even what it offers you as a writer of fiction in terms of creating an ending.
Yeah, wow, what a beautiful thread of questioning. And so you describe ritual as what we do when there is nothing else to do. Is that how you said it?
Yeah, yeah.
Oh, I love
Um,
that. Yeah. Um, That's gonna stay with me, I'm sure. And
Mm.
I'm thinking about the ending in Fortunes of Others, which, like you say, it's in the city of Varanasi, the city of death, as it's
Oh.
city of good death, as it's sometimes called. So people go to Varanasi um, looking to die because it's an auspicious place to die if you're a Hindu. And then
Mm.
it's on the banks of the river Ganges, which of course has a lot of significance to Hindus. And here is a man who has no interest in those religious observances.
Mhm.
Yet there's something really beautiful about the lights on the water and the song and the chants. And I think that the way in which ritual harmonizes us, no matter who we are, where we come from, when we step into ritual, I think we recognize that this is a way in which community comes together. And I
Mhm.
think you
Mhm.
feel that in that moment that, as
Mhm.
somebody who's been a loner pretty much for most of his life, certainly after he had to leave Afghanistan, I think in that moment, he feels a real sense of family. He
Mhm.
feels
Mhm.
that, okay, this little dog and this little boy and he himself, they have made something of a life with each other. And, I mean, not to give away the ending completely, but there's also there's also a note of sadness there as well.
Mhm.
And I suppose
Mhm.
as a writer, I'm looking to try and balance the note of sadness and the note
Mhm.
of possibility.
Mhm.
As
Mhm.
I just generally think about stories.
Mhm. Mhm. Oh, and it works so well there to do both, right? It is sad and it is hopeful, and we don't know exactly what's going to happen, but you sort of anticipate. So possibility.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Um, there's another story in the collection that I love that also has someone sort of stepping into the role of a parent, right? Someone who's lost a child or actually has had a miscarriage. And this is the story, A Mother's Work, and she sort of steps into a mother's role. And this, I wasn't going to go to that story necessarily here, but I was really struck by the way that in this story, becoming a father again, um, even though it's not a biological child, is sort of healing for the, how do you say it? Kubiwala?
Kabuliwala. So it's somebody
Kabuliwala.
from Kabul. Yeah.
Kabul. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, so he gets to be a father again, in the same way that the protagonist in A Mother's Work gets to be a mother, though she hasn't been able to physically be a mother of a child, although she kind of has that relationship with her husband. So,
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, even that story, I think, is very much about what it means to be a parent, even aspirationally in some
mhm,
cases.
mhm,
And just to talk about the setup of that story for a moment, A Mother's Work, it's of course we all know about matchmakers and how how rich of a subject it is to think about and write about matchmakers. But I wanted to sort of flip that on its head, and so it's about a woman who's a match breaker who's been hired to break a couple apart, and there's just one difficulty. The woman who she's been hired to um, to basically get rid of, that woman has a child, and I think in that experience, she finds herself softening, becoming a different person, and connecting with that parental self
mhm,
that all of
mhm,
us, whether we're parents or not, have. So yes, that was one of the themes that was running through the collection that I was exploring. Thank you.
mhm, mhm. Yeah, yeah. Um, so ritual is also an element in the short story Searching for Elijah,
Yeah.
a story that's set around a Passover Seder. and the protagonist Melina, and so both the Passover Seder and her conversion to Judaism. There's also a child from a previous relationship there. But I wondered if you could talk about food and cooking and how Melina is able to harness those to regain some power in the story.
Sure, sure. And I'll if it's okay, I'll share a little anecdote about how that story came to be.
Oh, great.
When I was living in Brooklyn, and this was quite a few years ago now, I would go to the farmers market, and it was there that I met a woman by the name of Aditi who had a kiosk, a stall where she was
Mm.
selling these amazing sauces and chutneys. And her little boy was running around in the farmers market. And she was from Kolkata, the city that I'm from. So we would speak to each other in Bengali, and we would talk about the places that we knew and the kinds of food that we enjoyed to eat and all that kind of stuff. And we had a nice rapport. And there was something about her and her character that really sort of stayed with me. And I think in some ways she very loosely became the inspiration for searching for Elijah. Well, I now live in the Hudson Valley near the city of Kingston, and lo and behold, Aditi set up a restaurant in Kingston. She read my book and she said, "Oh, I think I recognize myself in one of these stories in Searching for Elijah." And so just a few days ago, I did a reading at her
Uh-huh.
store, and it was such a lovely full cycle event. So yeah, I'm just thinking about that now and the way in which, words go out into the world, and sometimes beautiful connections can happen. And going back to your thread around ritual, I'll start out also personally sharing that for me, ritual is very important, and it's something that I've inherited, I think, from my wife, the poet Ilana Bell, who is a wonderful ritualist.
Mm.
And, from the ways in which, for example, we take time every Friday to really disconnect and come together as a family, to the ways in which we mark important events in our lives. It is a way by which I think time slows down. When you're in ritual, you're in community and you mark the passing of time. I think fiction works similarly, right? I think, time is the great subject of fiction. You can write, there's the great short story by Tobias Wolff, Bullet in the Brain, where for many paragraphs, Wolff is writing about someone who has been shot in the head, and the prose slows down, goes into the past. But I think writing in general is that exercise, whether you want to really slow down or whether you want to really speed up, like time is what we have in fiction to work with. So
Mhm.
yeah, that's how I'm thinking about ritual, is through this larger construct of time, and how we think about time as a cardinal substance.
Mhm, mhm, mhm. And for anyone who's been at a Passover Seder, time, you start to get really hungry, you want to eat, and there's still more ritual to
Right, and
go
the 40
on, right?
years of wandering in the desert, yes,
Right,
it all
right.
comes to it. Yeah.
But so in the end of that story, Melina ends up cooking her or making her sauces and her, that she knows from India.
Yeah.
Um, and it seems as if that's what the family is going to eat, maybe at their Passover Seder, right?
Yeah.
So there's a sort of blending of rituals and cultures and
Mm.
um
Right. And so that story is very much about dealing with identity and what it means for us to hold on to some parts of our identity that are important to us, even as we navigate other identities. And I think about this a lot in the context of my family. So being in a biracial multi-ethnic, multi-religious household. You know, my son is who's 8, he's getting it from from all directions, right? And I think about the ways in which he's incorporating different identities, identities that are from India, identities that are more Jewish based, or identities that are more American based, and in so many other dimensions as well. And for Malini in that story, in searching for Elijah, I think for her, the act of cooking is a process by which she's reclaiming her sense of self, her sense of autonomy. And rituals can do that, right? Rituals can help us come back into our sense of power, into our sense of knowing who we are in this world.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, there's you capture her ambivalence so well in that story, her her pull towards the past and her desire to provide for her son and into the future. And there was one sentence, and I mean, in a book of beautiful sentences, it seems almost funny to pull this one, but I feel like I learned something from it about such a simple and clear way, really, to convey her ambivalence. And it's on page 150, and she's with her boyfriend, fiance Stephen, and they're on the beach. And he's asking, what she's worried about. And with the word though, which you repeat 3 times, you're able to convey this deep ambivalence. And I'm going to read it. It says, they sat down in the sand. She began to feel an ache in her belly, though there was the wind of the ocean to comfort her, though there was Stephen stroking the space between her shoulders, though the sky had turned perfectly cloudless. And I just love the way that the repetition of the though is able to contain, or to convey the multitudes of her feelings, right? That she's going to do this, but there's the struggle, right? Like she should feel okay, but she doesn't. She should feel okay, but she doesn't. And it's such a great sentence.
Yeah,
So
thank
thank
you
you
so
for
much.
that.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I really appreciate the close reading. I think about the ways in which, so like T.S. Eliot talked about the objective correlative, this idea that we look out into the world, and then what we see in the world is reflective of our characters' emotions. And sometimes that's true, but sometimes there's a disconnect where it's a perfectly cloudless night, and yet you're feeling this tremendous ache in your belly,
Mm-hmm,
and you
mm-hmm,
can't escape the somatic truth, the truth that your body is telling you that this is uncomfortable, that you haven't really reconciled all of your feelings. So yeah, I think that's what I was going for in those lines.
Yeah, it's really, it's so beautiful. Um, as I read these stories, and that line is an example, but as I read all of them, I was reminded of Alice Munro's stories, and she's a big favorite of mine. And for a lot of reasons, I thought of her while reading these, but one in particular is that your stories like hers feel generous to the characters, who make mistakes, who fail to do what they set out to do. But you both treat them with what feels like curiosity and compassion. And so I was pleased to learn that you count Monroe as an inspiration. And I wonder if you could talk about how she's influenced you and what you've learned from her stories.
Oh gosh, yes. I owe Alice Munro so much, as I believe so many short story writers must feel the same way.
Right.
I was teaching hate ship, courtship, love ship, marriage, the fairly long Alice Munro short story recently, and I was remarking again how wonderfully Monroe starts with a character who comes across as rather unlikable, you know, a woman who is being very rude to a postal clerk
Yeah.
for, you know, for no reason that we can discern in that initial scene. And then
Mhm.
through the course of this story, we begin to find empathy for her.
Mhm.
And, you know, I suppose that is one of my core values in the world, which is to say that, you know, no matter what we have done, who we are, there is always room for empathy and there's always room for connection. And I think, you know, Monroe, she painted many dark characters. And at the same time, I think she always found a way um, to give us space to love them as well. And so that's something I appreciated about her work, just the largeness of her heart, how
Mhm.
she could
Mhm.
hold so many different kinds of characters and show their sides and all of their darkness and light. What do you love about Monroe?
Mm. I think there's well, I've studied her endings a lot.
Yeah, yeah,
And she does amazing things in the ending, right? Like
crazy
yeah,
things.
yeah. And so like sort of tried to characterize them all, and she'll do like a backflip, you know, where she will go like in that one story, Carried Away,
Yeah,
where she'll
yeah,
go, you know, she'll tell this whole long story of this woman's life, and then in the last paragraph go all the way back to how she ended up in the town in which the whole story takes
yeah.
place, right?
Yes. Yes.
So,
I mean,
so like what you were saying about stories being our subject is time, she
yeah.
really plays with time. And you do some of that too, that sort of we're in a moment in several stories, like the import, right? And then there's a flash forward um, to some later moment in which the character is reconsidering the moment of the story. Um, right. You know that what I'm talking about, where he's like, oh, years later, he'll talk to his therapist, or in therapy, he'll remember this, but I feel
Right.
like you do that in other stories too, where there's a big leap in time and then coming back. Um,
Yeah. Yeah. And you know, I think one other thing that I appreciate about Monroe, and I think you're getting at it too, which is that she explored so many different structures of the short
mhm,
story
mhm,
that we
mhm.
might think about the short story as this unary structure on the surface, this traditional Freytagian pyramid that
Right.
starts with an exciting incident and, you know, some amount of rising action leading to a climax and a denouement. And of course, that is a perfectly fine structure for a story. But if you read Monroe, you'll see a million other structures. Like,
Right.
you know, Carried Away, she does this really crazy thing at the end, and she has so many of those so-called crazy things where she's really exploring other structures of the short story. And
Mhm,
so, yeah,
mhm.
I think if you read her long enough, you develop a lexicon of these are all the many different beautiful structures of a short story.
Yeah, yeah. So reading her feels kind of permissive, right? Like she's saying, go ahead, tell the story the way
Good.
you want to, right?
Yes, yes, right, right. It gives you a lot of freedom as you
Mm-hmm.
read
Mm-hmm.
Monroe. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
Yeah.
which you may not expect, I think, because I think she's sort of known more as, you know, she's been sometimes put in this genre of traditional realism, which makes sense. But I think in terms of structurally, I think she was very experimental in some ways.
Yeah, I agree. I agree. She's sort of like a sneaky experimentalist.
Yes,
Yeah,
exactly. That's
yeah, yeah, yeah. Um, so there's a cluster in the of stories in the middle of the collection that pits sort of powerful mothers against their sons' beloveds, right? So searching for Elijah is one, a mother's work is another, and then the tantric came to town is still another. And I wondered about your process pulling the stories together as a collection, and if you thought about, clusters in that way, or how did you what was your process of organizing, I guess?
Yeah, it's a great question. So, before I started publishing fiction, I spent many years as a poet. And one of the ways in which I thought about organizing collections of poetry was thinking about the connections between individual poems. So of course, you're thinking about the larger themes of a collection, but it's also really important when you finish a poem to think about the last line of the poem and the first line of the next poem, and how those are in conversation. It's almost like it's a relay race between the poem and the next one. And so, for example, in the case of A Mother's Work and Searching for Elijah, I think of those as a dyad, really. Like these are stories that are very much in conversation with each other. They're both about mothers and a sense of orthodoxy. In the case of Searching for Elijah, it's an American Jewish family. In the case of A Mother's Work, it's an Indian Hindu family, but they are both enmeshed in their own orthodoxy. And there are characters who are fighting against that orthodoxy. So these are stories that are meant to be read together. And, throughout the collection, I think, not always, but I think there are a number of other such pairs. And then, I also thought about the first story and the last story being in conversation with each other. The title of the collection is A Small Sacrifice for an Enormous Happiness, of course, but it's meant ironically. Many of these sacrifices are not small, and sometimes the happiness that's received is dubious. And so that last story where the Kabuliwala feels a sense of great happiness being a father again, and also the sacrifice that he weighs toward the end of that story, felt very much in conversation with the beginning of the book.
Yeah. So not really in terms of clusters, but more organic line, almost first line, last line, like that.
Yeah, I would say it's sort of thematic connections between individual stories. Yeah. And I know you mentioned you were working on a new collection. How are you thinking about ordering that? What are some of the principles that you're bringing to bear?
Oh gosh. So, not as smart as you. I mean, I was thinking like in terms of, there's a couple that are you make use of the first person plural. And so I wanted those sort of to act as bookends. And then I have a couple that are sort of look at different historical moments. And so those I wanted sort of spread out. Yeah. So we'll see. But I just heard from my agent and she's moving them all around. So but it's interesting. It's really interesting to me to because I don't think as a story writer that many of us think about theme so much while we're working, right? It's sort of a later consideration. So but it certainly makes sense in this context to think about those themes. And I think I'm just not very good at thinking about theme because I've spent so much time not thinking about it.
Right. Yeah. And I think that's so common. I mean, certainly in modern English writing, right, we're thinking more about characters, immersing ourselves in the lives of characters and trying to avoid intentionally adding symbols and trying to intentionally avoid being didactic. And so, but then there are these, sometimes beautiful thematic concerns that start to emerge. Well, one of the techniques that I've adopted over the years is when I have a first draft, I will go through and with a pen, I'll mark out the lines that feel like they don't fit in the story because they're so surprising and so different. And sometimes the story is actually about those lines, sometimes it's not the story that, your very conscious mind wanted to put on the paper. It's more about the subconscious. And so I guess the way to start to think about it is that the themes are really from the subconscious if you let the subconscious go where it wants to go.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Right, right, right. That's great. That's great. I think we have time for another question, or yeah, probably one more question, right?
Sure, sounds good.
Okay. So this is well, I'll go with this one. So there's been some discussion in the literary community about writers needing to stay in their lane in terms of character. So that is writing only characters who are like you in terms of race, religion, gender, sexuality. And you bravely and successfully crossed those lanes in a small sacrifice. And I haven't read your novel, but it's on my to read list now. And it sounds like that is the case there as well. Can you talk about writing characters who are not you, the challenges and the rewards, and why we might do such a thing?
Yes, this is such a fraught topic these days and an interesting line of inquiry. And I would love to get your take as well. I will begin. And sometimes I refer to the excellent essay by Zadie Smith called In Defense of Fiction, where she covers this question from so many different angles. And one of the things that she talks about, which I think is so important, is that the risk of being outside of our lane is that for so many years, marginalized groups did not have a voice. And for so many years, writers not of that particular group were writing the stories that, were not really theirs to tell. And there were no other voices coming out. And so I do think it is a real risk, and I understand why it is such a fraught topic and why it's such an important conversation. At the same time, we fall in love with the people that we fall in love with, and there isn't always a guiding policy about who we should, who we should find and who we should love, and there's something magical and mysterious about that. And I think there's something magical and mysterious about who we are interested in writing about and who we are interested in really putting our hearts into and connecting with. And in that essay, Zadie Smith goes on to talk about how for her, the most compelling character that she's ever written is a British Chinese gay man. And she is not none of those things and any of those dimensions, and yet this is the character who has really stayed with her and is closest to her. And I think this is really the gift of fiction, that we are able to move beyond ourselves and peer into another's consciousness. And I certainly hope that as a medium, it doesn't leave us, that we continue to have that gift, because I do think it's something that, allows us to encounter each other and to have more of a sense of who we are in this world. Yeah.
Yeah.
And where do you stand on this question, Rachel?
I haven't read the Zadie Smith essay, but I'm going to. I feel like it's so limiting to be told you can only write, who you are, and that it feels like because I agree with you, one of my core values is compassion. I think it's an act of compassion to try to understand someone who is different than you, that's maybe the hardest thing we can do, but also maybe one of the most valuable, right? So yeah. And I think if you do it right, it shouldn't matter, right? Like it shouldn't,
Yes. Yeah, and I think it is very much about the doing it right and doing it with this real sense of integrity, and wrestling with the question, I think, is very important.
Yes, yes, yeah. And I felt that I could ask you that because I felt that you had done it so well. And I know it is fraught, so it was maybe unkind to throw it at you as your
No,
final
no, no,
question.
no, not at all, not at all. Important question. I'm happy you asked it.
Oh, good. Oh, good. Good, good, good. Well, I understand you're going to read a little bit more for everyone.
Oh, yeah, I'll just read a paragraph, and it's the final paragraph from a story that is called Lilavati's Lilavati's Fire, excuse me. And it's about a woman who is uh, trying to make an airplane in her garage using the drawings of an ancient mathematician. So I'll just read, yeah, the last two paragraphs here. Later that night, when she'd retired to her bed and Harish had retired to his on the other side of the nightstand, she stayed awake for a while to hear the music of the cicadas, but Harish's snoring was supreme. So she went outside in her nightdress and heard them on the lawn. She sat on the grass and smelled the honeysuckle planted next door. As a girl in Kolkata, she had sucked the honey from the beaks of these flowers, living inside their smell, drunk with life. She stared at her air chariot on the concrete. It seemed to stare back with derision. She had used the drawings of an ancient mathematician who had never known of Newton, of his third law of action, equal reaction. And when the miracle of flight hadn't come and she was still on the ground, she didn't think of Newton or Bernoulli's principle of how curves under pressure create the most important form, lift. She thought instead of that first moment when Sanjay had come out from her body and the nurse had passed him into her arms as if he were the most precious gift. And all she had thought then, as Harish looked on weak-kneed and teary-eyed, was how ugly her little boy seemed, how covered with blood on his sagging skin. But she held him anyway, with his cave of a mouth, with his arms outstretched like a fledgling bird. Thank you. Thank you so much, Rachel, for this conversation. I really, really appreciate it.
Yeah, it was lovely. My pleasure. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Jay, for the wonderful reading. And thank you, Rachel, for a memorable conversation. And thanks to everyone for joining us tonight. As a reminder, Jay's book has been linked in the chat if you'd like to order it. Yeah, have a great night, everyone.
Have a great night. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.